Okay, hi everyone. We're ready here for part 3 of A New Republic. It's a bit lengthy, but there's a lot of information to squeeze in at the beginning. The new constitution, the new government is very young, and there's a lot of building of institutions that later on we can just, assume that you understand. Um, so last time that we met, um, we were having some difficulties with the British, those terrible British, we suffered under their tyranny for so long. And then as soon as we get our independence, they start trying to play us off our allies, ruined our relationship with the French. So Jefferson will retire after 2 terms. He was very popular despite those ridiculous regulations that he imposed under the Embargo Act of 1807. Every advisor told him not to. He did it anyway, very stubbornly, and it had no results, and it was disastrous for America. Very divisive. The South that was much more agrarian and not as much tied to exports, loved and admired Jefferson, trying to stick up for America. New Englanders just hated him because they saw our future is tied to Great Britain in commerce and trade, and they were very pro-British in their foreign policy outlook and thought the French Revolution was terrible. So Jefferson, just befuddled by this problem, threw his hands up and just said, I'm going to retire. He was an old man by this point. He was, into his 60s, which is very old back then. So he hands it off to his partner in crime, little Jimmy Madison. So I don't say that disparagingly. Madison was our shortest president. By most records, he was 5 feet 4 inches tall and tipped the scales at his heaviest at 100 pounds. But as they say, big things come in small packages. Might have been the most brilliant of our founding fathers. If you read this week, your primary source, extra credit activity, if you read the Federalist Papers, Fed 10 and especially Fed 51, he was a legal genius, which was amazing. People didn't have as much access to information back then. You had to buy libraries, and he did that, read them all, did a lot of studying. But he is going to be befuddled and beset by these problems as well. Madison's biggest problem of his entire administration was the continuation of impressment. The British did not stop. They just kept doing this. And as the Napoleonic Wars got worse, guess what? Tensions on the high seas got even worse with this impressment policy. Along with that, Madison was very befuddled about problems of the West. So those problems that had emerged in the 1790s that would plague America for the next 100 years over who controls the land, who claims the land, who got there first, who's legally in charge, what treaties are appropriate. Ohio became very violent in the 1790s. Talked about that last time with Little Turtle and Arthur St. Clair and Anthony Wayne, all that saga. And so finally, the Treaty of Greenville cleared out Ohio for white settlement, essentially. All Native Americans were removed to Indiana, where everybody thought that they would have that in perpetuity. Well, guess what? Just 15 years later, pretty much by 1810, the situation was untenable in Indiana. Ohio had filled up. Land-hungry bankers essentially went out and bought up all the land, driving up the price, and then flipped it and sold it to very poor yeoman farmers. And now poor farmers were looking further west. Where is it cheaper? Where is it cheapest? Indiana, very fertile land, very good. And so again, people started pouring in, disputes over claims, there was violence. And so General Harrison, William Henry Harrison, was sent in time after time after time to chase down the next resistance fighter, Native American resistance fighter. His name would be Tecumseh. His half-brother Tenskwata, or the Prophet, as most people called him, also joined him. They were Shawnee, but they had unified all the tribes of the Northwest, the Blackfeet, the Pawnee, the Maumee, every tribe in the Northwest, the old Northwest, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, that area. And it was becoming a huge problem because this time around, Tecumseh would be aided and abetted by the British, meaning that he would launch these raids on, American villages, towns, settlements in Indiana, and then he would escape into Canada, which was British Canada at the time. Harrison could chase Tecumseh all over the Northwest, but he dared not, excuse me, cross the border into Canada, as that would be an invasion. And you did not want to have a land war on that northern border. Everybody was afraid of that. But what did you do? Indiana would always be plagued by violence. There would always be this problem. And the British encouraged it. They gave Tecumseh weapons, food, support, logistical resources, horses, everything that he wanted. And this was seen by many as sort of a proxy war, an aiding of rebels within American territory against us. And it's not, the view was not just that this is annoying or this is a disturbance to us, but this was a real threat, that the West was very thinly populated, not very many settlers there. It was out of control. Most of the settlers were Native American and seemed to be allied with America's enemy. They were, Britain was impressing our sailors in the high seas, and they were engaging in these activities. And so for both of those reasons, Madison started cranking up the heat more and more and more. He started to, in 1809, when he first became president, cut off trade with both Britain and France. And again, thinking this won't last very long, said, we'll establish full diplomatic and economic relations for whoever stops doing this first. The French never completely stopped their how do I want to say, their blockade of British goods and attacking of American ships. It certainly declined and decreased, but it would ebb and flow and go back and forth. This policy was a complete failure. So this leads us inexorably to the War of 1812, probably the weirdest, most ambiguous, most bizarre war in our history. It's the forgotten war. Nobody knows very much even about it. Although I will say in Canada, it's called our War for Independence. Or the American War, sometimes it's called. It's one that they pay a lot more attention to because, as they saw it, American aggressive imperialists were trying to invade their country and take their land, and they, dutifully defended their honor and their land and their independence. We didn't quite view it the same way, but at the same time, we've all but forgotten this. This is a footnote in most history books. So these are the two reasons for the war: continuation of impressment and the aid of Native American rebels, essentially, in Indiana and the Northwest. So Madison again and again and again tried every nonviolent measure, and it just didn't work. Finally, he issued an ultimatum in early 1812 and said, you need to cease and desist, and they refused. Now, the irony of all ironies here is because of the disconnect in communication, Madison would go to Congress, lay this course out, ask for a declaration of war in June of 1812. He would get it, but actually before we had declared war on Britain, they voted in Parliament to stop impressment altogether. They didn't want to have a war with us. They thought that they could push us and push us and push us. And then by the time that we got angry and might fight, they didn't want to fight a war in America and on the high seas with Napoleon at the same time, stretch their resources. But they just thought we wouldn't fight back, and that they could pull back on this if they needed to. Well, they finally realized they were pushing us to the breaking point. They voted in Parliament just a few weeks before, June of 1812, that they weren't going to do this anymore. And by the time that news had reached America, it was too late already. It was like, oops, we've already invaded Canada. There's no take backs here. It's like, babe, I can't take you back. I already changed my relationship status on social media. Everybody knows I broke up with you. I'm not taking you back. Same thing here. It was like, we've already invaded Ontario, so we're just going to continue on with this project. So the war is a near fiasco. It was beyond ridiculous. We had not fought a war in 30 years. We're really bad at it. British troops in Canada were fresh. They had just fought in a long series of wars starting in 1792. They were well trained, even though there were many fewer of them. We had 10 times the population of Canada and 10 times the military population. Everybody thought, and Jefferson said this as well, that the conquest of Canada would be a mere matter of marching. We just need to march across the border, plant the flag. Everybody thought, most of those people in Canada are old Tories anyway. They'll see the stars and stripes. They'll remember the bonds of friendship and everything. The French population there hates the British anyway, and so they'll rally to our cause. Well, it was not the case. They fought back hard. We invaded, we were pushed out of Canada, and this war would seesaw back and forth. There were problems far worse than even the Revolutionary War, where the government couldn't borrow because There was no national bank. The national bank expired, it had a 20-year charter. Hamilton charters it in 1791. Well, guess what? It expired in 1811 during Madison's presidency. So there was really no means to borrow. Tax revenue had dried up to nothing because our tax revenue was, guess what, on imports from Great Britain, and trade dropped off a cliff once we declared war. So there was no money, there was no way to borrow. The government defaulted on its contracts, meaning it wasn't paying any of its contractors for weapons or boots or anything. Soldiers were told to show up with their own materials and they'd get stuff in the field, and it didn't come for years. It was embarrassing, incredibly so. In fact, the only few victories we do have are on the high seas, which is supremely ironic because the British were, par excellence at the time. And in a handful of naval engagements, the USS Constitution, held its own and fought very well against the HMS Guerriere, and was dubbed Old Ironsides because they fired their cannonballs against the side and it just harmlessly bounced off. Kind of a small footnote, and a small footnote of a war, though, because this doesn't really turn the tide of the war. Slowly, things begin to, change a bit, meaning that the U.S. is able to, in 1813, invade. What many of you may not know is that the United States invaded Canada in 1813, marched into York, which is today Toronto. You might have heard of it. It's the largest city in Canada, and burned it to the ground. Now, it was a small village at the time. Canada was, largely a wasteland. There was only 700,000 or 800,000 people in the entire country. But nonetheless, this was not a nice thing to do. In fact, almost in the vein of the Vikings of old, the United States runs off with all the books from the public library and even the ceremonial mace from Town Hall, which is a medieval weapon that symbolizes strength and authority. We did not return that mace until 1931, much, much later, until the Hoover administration in the 20th century. So relations were pretty bad with us and the British for a long time. People forget that. 2 world wars helped a lot to unruffle those feathers. So the British were very angry with us with burning down York. This is not often told. Very recently, just a year or two ago, President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau of Canada got into it a little bit. We slapped some tariffs on some of their steel exports to our country. And Trudeau was saying, you're legally only able to do that for security reasons. We're not a threat to you. We're your closest ally. Canada is. And our biggest trade partner. People forget about that too. They think it's China or Mexico or the European Union, and more trade with Canada and the United States than any other countries on earth that we have trade with. And so this egregious action is going to be paid back in spades. Now, what happens is the next year in 1814, the British actually had captured Napoleon, exiled him after the Battle of Leipzig to Elba, and he will escape later. But temporarily in 1814, all of Europe is at peace, which is a bad thing for us because now Napoleon can take the British can take all of their troops out of Europe and then send them to America to go fight against us, which is the last thing that we wanted. We lost our only ally, essentially, the French. The British would try to capture James Madison and win this in one fell swoop. They sailed up the Potomac River, they disembark, they marched through Washington, D.C., and they put the entire city to the torch, which it was a very small city in 1812, mostly a swamp with just a few buildings, but they did put every single building to the torch. They burned the only newspaper in town, the Intelligencer. They burned the White House. Some people know this story, that this is embarrassing. Madison had to flee his own home. He had to get in essentially a wagon and load all the paintings and valuables onto it and flee to Baltimore so that the British wouldn't capture him. Then the British came into the White House, looked around to try to find Madison, realized he had fled, and then they proceeded to eat his dinner, which is about the most embarrassing thing I can think of. They put their big muddy boots up on his table. There was a nice turkey dinner that was set out right before the alarm went off, and Madison just left without eating dinner, and the British took apart his turkey, ate it, and raided his wine cellar and toasted to little Jimmy. and then proceeded to set fire to the White House and leave. Now, some accounts today will tell you they burned it down. It didn't burn down. It did burn for a few hours that night. Miraculously, out of nowhere, a hurricane descended on Washington, D.C. and dumped about 2 or 3 feet of water on all the flames and put it out. But it was severely damaged, and Madison would not live in the White House for a couple of years while it got repaired. So maybe shouldn't have fought this war. A little embarrassing. The British would regroup and try to invade Baltimore, and they would be repelled in Baltimore Harbor. This is the Battle of Fort McHenry, where we get the Star-Spangled Banner. If you read the first refrain, the first stanza of the Star-Spangled Banner, it describes the Battle of Fort McHenry, which the U.S. won. It repelled this invasion. So then the British realized, aha, the key is not on the East Coast, it's in New Orleans. Remember, this is, as Jefferson said, the cork in the bottle. If we can go and take New Orleans, then the whole security of the interior of the continent is in our hands. Which leads us to another weird factor of the war. The biggest victory of the war by far is the Battle of New Orleans, and it was fought 2 weeks after the war was already over. Meaning, peace had been agreed upon on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1814, but the peace delegation was in Belgium. And they were dealing with all these other issues about Napoleon and the borders of Europe. And there was just a side delegation dealing with this sideshow in America. It's the weirdest peace agreement I've ever seen, meaning nothing was decided. They just decided what many countries do in war is, let's go back status quo ante bellum, which means let's go back to the situation as it was before the war. We had pressed them and said, we want you to at least admit that impressment was wrong and illegal, that you're sorry for it, and that you won't do it again. And they said no, no, and no. They said, we're not sorry. We were right to do it, and we'll do it again in the future. No money was exchanged, no territory was exchanged, nothing was agreed upon other than the US would withdraw from Canada and the British would pull out from the US. This statement is sent off to America, but before it even arrives and news of peace arrives, we fight and win our biggest battle. An unheard of general from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, would lead a very victorious battle against the British defending New Orleans, and it was incredible. He and his defenders there just lost a few dozen men. They were dug in, they had cannon, and the British were just wiped out. They lost thousands of soldiers. So the way Americans received the news is Andy Jackson defeated the British, and then a week later they hear peace. So it seemed to most Americans that Jackson's victory over the British gave the negotiators the ability to get such a great deal, which then Madison could claim this is a victory, which if you actually look at it, it's not. It's a tie, it's a stalemate, which probably explains why Americans don't even like to talk about this war. We like victories and defeats. There's great books and films about victory. There's great films and books about defeat. There's not too many American books and films about ties. We don't like them. That's why many Americans still don't like soccer, you know. Many do, but it still doesn't have the popularity of American sports because we go until there is a victor, right? It just seems un-American that you would play and then, all right, it's a tie. We'll just end 0-0 tie. Are you kidding me? What's the point of the game? Basketball, you just keep going until one side wins, triple overtime, quadruple overtime. Now I hear in American football, technically you can have a tie, but it's pretty rare. You have a couple of overtimes and that almost never happens. In any case, this is the ambiguous nature of this conflict. So who are the winners? It's very unclear. We did not acquire Canada, which was part of the reason. We didn't get the British to agree to stop impressment. They did stop, but they stopped because they didn't have to anymore. Napoleon was in prison by that time, exiled. So did we even have to fight it? Some historians say, well, we did sort of as a matter of pride, just to show, hey, you can't just treat us like a former colony. We're going to stick up for ourselves. And the British would respect us more. Seemed like a pretty big risk, especially when you reflect on the fact that there was almost a civil war over this war, meaning the New England states were dead set against this, and the way that they behaved was highly questionable. And this story's not told too much because we usually think of Southerners as the ones that always wanted to secede and always creating problems with the federal government. In this case, the North did. Excuse me. So what happened essentially was New England voted entirely against this war pretty much every senator and every congressman from New England said this is a silly war. It's who cares about the West? And everybody in New England, and this is the bustling hub of America, they felt that the West was this backwater, like who cares? Just let Tecumseh have it. It's just so far and remote, ridiculous. Ironically, they were the most affected by impressment because they're the most tied into the shipping trade, but they just sort of thought of it as breakage, right? Business is so good with the British. They're at war. They're desperate for our goods. We're making so much money. You know, it's the cost of doing business. Who cares? Because if we go to war, business will drop off a cliff, which it did. So New England states for 2 years did some highly questionable things, not just protest against the war. Every New England governor said, you can't use our territory to invade Canada. So Madison couldn't march troops across Vermont or New Hampshire or Maine to try to invade Canada. He had to go through New York and territories out west. He couldn't recruit any soldiers there because Madison basically said, I'm not going to use a national army. We'll just pull the state militias together. And states in New England said, we refuse to participate. Some bankers in New England actually sold British war bonds in a time of war, which if you don't know what that means, that's the way governments fund wars. So what that meant was in Boston, you could walk into a bank and buy a bond, which was literally giving money to the British crown to buy bullets and ships to go kill your countrymen, Americans. I mean, this is insanity. This would be like today going into a bank and giving money to Iran so that they could go bomb, you know, our allies in the Middle East or terrorize American soldiers in Iraq. It would be illegal. You would be considered a traitor for doing it. But America was so new at the time, and many people had very little faith in the Constitution or in the government, and they did this. And they would regret it later, because with the end of the war, with Andrew Jackson's victory, Madison's able to sell this not as a war of choice, but a war of necessity that we won. When the peace terms come, he says, I was victorious, I won this war, and there's a huge surge in nationalism. And all the New Englanders that had kind of toyed with the idea of allying themselves with the British, he felt very sheepish afterwards. The Federalist Party completely implodes after the war. No one in the country wanted to stand up and say, I'm a Federalist. They just couldn't do that. They had ruined their reputation. So it's a very weird war. It's a war that shouldn't have begun. If we had the news that impressment had stopped, we wouldn't have declared war to begin with. And the only major battle of the war that matters is fought 2 weeks after the war is technically over. And it's a weird stalemate. So the winner is very nebulous. The losers are very clear, much like in the Revolution. The Native American tribes, this was a disaster for them, particularly in the Southwest, but it was no picnic in the Northwest either. Tecumseh's defeat at the Battle of the Thames shatters this pan-resistance movement. He was the only thing that could really link all the various clashing tribes of the Northwest. And Tecumseh is killed in battle, and quite literally with his death, this Native American resistance movement just disintegrates. And it paves the way for people just to move in and claim the Northwest. Similarly, before Andrew Jackson got to New Orleans, he marched through Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and in inflicting a painful series of humiliating defeats on various tribes there, and negotiated on his own, which was illegal, but he did it anyway. And he claimed that all of the Southwest had been given over to the US. So the Southwest was a very peaceful place. By 1816, you could move there. You didn't dare move there in 1802, but by 1815, it was pretty safe after this war. And it was devastating because land would be expropriated essentially. So let's go to the last slide. Let's see if we can wrap this up. So Madison, interesting guy. After the war, he learned a series of lessons and he decided to do a complete 180. Now, the Federalist Party had basically committed suicide. They basically sent a threatening letter in the last few months of the war, threatening to secede. All of these leading politicians in New England got together at Hartford, Connecticut, and threatened to secede and leave the Union and merge with Great Britain. They were already meeting with British officers and talking about giving away a slice of Maine to the British if they could get neutrality, which is highly illegal and unconstitutional, but they did it anyway. Luckily, nothing came of this, and luckily the war ended before the secession threat really, gained any steam. And so Madison was very magnanimous, though. Rather than take vengeance on all these people in New England that he saw as traitors, he said, I'm going to reach out to you. So what he did was he started to incorporate Federalist ideas and Federalist people into his administration. He did a complete 180 on the national bank. He said, I learned my lesson. We went bankrupt in the middle of this war. We couldn't tax, we couldn't spend. We very nearly lost the war. And so I'm going to recharter a second national bank, which shocked everyone. His very good friend Jefferson thought he had lost his mind. The thing that really changed was that the Industrial Revolution had come to America. The war had temporarily created these bizarre conditions that made industrialization possible. So let me explain. There was a blockade all up and down the eastern coast of America. We could not import anything for those 2.5 years of war. And so we didn't get any revenue coming in, and the economy was deeply hurt. Now, our number one import from Great Britain was textiles. It was cloth and finished clothes, shirts and pants. Couldn't find it anywhere during the war. People had to just make do with the wardrobe that they had. Now, what this happens is when you have shortages, it creates a huge spike in prices. Prices send signals to producers to say, make that, because it's very expensive. And so a lot of really smart Yankee investors said, geez, if we could open up one of these steam-powered factories like they have in Liverpool and in Manchester, we could make a fortune. Didn't have the plans, though. They bought them from an immigrant who literally stenciled out on a piece of paper kind of a crude drawing of one of these power looms that the British had for about 40 years in these factories. It was illegal to do it, but this guy did it anyway, sold the plans to investors who then opened up the first factory in America in 1814. Proper factory, like machine power. Like you have a kettle that you heat with wood or coal, it heats water, the water becomes steam, which pushes pistons that you can then attach to various things that will move rapidly. And the first thing ever is a power loom. And you can work on a power loom and produce many more times shirts and pants and cloth than just weaving it by hand. So the first factory opens in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1814, and it's a byproduct of the war because prices were so high. They made a fortune during those 2 years of war. Now, when the war ended and competition resumed, they got a visit from President Madison who said, geez, this is cool. I don't like factories for Virginia, you know, we're a tobacco economy, but I want to help you out in New England. What do you need? And they said the three things that Hamilton had subscribed to 20 years ago. We want a national bank so that there's credit easily available and that the dollar is regulated and easy to come by. Second, we need a protective tariff that puts a higher price on shirts and pants from Britain. And third, we want internal improvements. We need our harbors fixed up and we need roads to the west and canals and all this stuff. Madison was opposed to all three of those things for all the years he knew Hamilton, and he did a complete 180 and passed an economic package his last year in office in 1816 and adhered to every single one of those things. So there didn't seem to be a need for a Federalist Party. There was now a new National Republican Party that everybody belonged to, but it had different factions. Men like John Quincy Adams, son of former President John Adams, would call himself a National Republican. Really, he's a Federalist, just calling himself something different because the Federalist Party had lost all of its cachet. So Monroe, the next president, because again, we set this standard, 2 terms and you step down. The next president is the last president of this Virginia dynasty. You had Washington, you would have Jefferson, now you'd have Madison, and lastly, you'd have Monroe, another Virginia slave owner, another Republican, and again, I mean Republican from, this time period. And Monroe, again, very magnanimous. He didn't lash out at New Englanders in anger. Instead, he invited people into the cabinet. He tried to bring back that old Washingtonian politics. His inaugural address in 1817, he said, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, we are all Americans. And he appointed to his top position in government, the Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, who, without a doubt, is our greatest Secretary of State ever. Now, we've had a lot of successful ones, but if you look at John Quincy Adams, he had unbelievable successes and really no, fiascos or defeats of any kind. So let's go over them real quick. The first is the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817. This formally ended about 3 decades of war with Great Britain, meaning we fought the revolution, got a peace treaty. It mostly was settled, but there were still these tricky issues. Where's the border with Canada exactly? Nobody exactly knew. Impressment, all of these issues. Treaty of Ghent didn't solve any of this. And so Adams painstakingly, he got these huge maps that you rolled out like a carpet, and they would get on their hands and knees and work out the borders in every situation. And the treaty is signed. This is the most successful peace treaty in human history. It's amazing. You have to factor in two things. Number one, this border between the US and Canada is the longest border in the world. It is over 3,000 miles long. It traverses wilderness, maritime boundaries, and then at some parts it's just a latitude line where you can't even really demarcate where it is. And there has been no violation of this border in 203 years. We just had the 200-year anniversary of it. We're still at peace with Canada. And I don't know about you, but I don't ever go to bed at night worried that we might have a war with Canada. It's just not in the cards, I don't think. Now, things are a little tense in the leadership right now, but not as much as it is between us and pretty much everybody else. Canada, it's unthinkable. They're number one trade partner. They're what are we going to do, invade Canada and take their maple syrup and their hockey sticks? They're such nice, pleasant people, right? Their music is terrible. They have those insidious accents and those ridiculous coins that always, invade our pockets and we can't get rid of them, but they're nice people, right? This was the success of Quincy Adams setting up a peace agreement that would last over 200 years. It's the longest boundary in history, and it was with this hostile neighbor for a while, and then we made peace. So, second, the Adams-Onis Treaty, or the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819. This solved our conflict with the Spanish in the West. There were all the problems with us buying Louisiana. The Spanish felt that had been stolen by the French and then given to us, and they didn't agree that we controlled it. So for a long time, they just said, we're not going to sign that agreement. We're not going to agree with that. Well, Spain was in desperate times in 1819. This was the genius of John Quincy Adams. He just waited until the opponent was desperate. They had just fought a series of wars, losing them all, and they had lost their entire empire. Between 1810 and 1823, Spain lost pretty much their entire empire, with three exceptions. They held the Philippines, they held Cuba, they held Puerto Rico. Everything else was taken from them. In a series of revolutions, essentially, what happened was Napoleon invades Spain in 1810. Spain is then cut off from their colonies, and all of the people living in the colonies decided, geez, this would be a nice time just to declare our independence. They couldn't do anything about it. And so they do. One by one, these countries declare their independence. Spain, after 1815, tries, rather pathetically, to send troops to the New World to overturn these revolutions, and they failed. They had borrowed heavily, mostly from American banks, and they had defaulted. And so John Quincy Adams was holding all the cards. He went to them and he said, hey, we want two things from you. Number one, we want your agreement that Louisiana is legally ours, and we need to get out the big maps and settle the border there. And so the border here, kind of this brown and green region, where Louisiana was decided to be part of the US, and this area in brown was decided to be part of Mexico, the new, country, or actually first Spain, in 1819, and then just 3 years later, it would revert to Mexico. So they agreed to that. They had really no options. The other thing is that John Quincy Adams said, we want Florida. And this is one of these examples where a person is in office and they do something that they don't want to do, but they know it's probably for the greater good of the country. This was something that Southerners wanted. Florida's in the South. It would add a new slave territory and slave state to the Union. And what Florida was really known for as being thinly, sparsely populated, hardly any Spaniards lived there. It was mostly inhabited by a Native American tribe called the Seminoles and runaway slaves from the South. That was the one place. If you were a slave, this network of gossip went from plantation to plantation saying, if you can escape and get on a raft or get away on foot, head south. When you get to Florida, you can live in sanctuary. And it was. Slaves and Seminoles would live in this kind of biracial community and built this thriving area. Jackson had invaded it in 1818 and tried to clear it out and failed. After it was acquired in 1819, Jackson is sent back. He brutally makes war on the Seminoles and the Maroons, the runaway slaves, and gets them to sign away Florida, and they're going to be evacuated and sent to Georgia to live on reservations. Something John Quincy Adams did not want to do, but he thought, you know, half the country is the represented interests of slave owners. This is what they want. They wanted to extinguish any hope of slaves. They thought this would disquiet escapes and rebellions because slaves would have no hope. They would get the news that Florida was not a place you could escape to anymore. And I guess for long-term security, it was good because now you guys can go there on vacations and, you know, hey, Disney World's open right now, even though Disneyland is closed. California, you know, believes in these lockdowns a lot more. Florida doesn't care. So Florida becomes part of the US. Why would Spain ever agree to these humiliating terms? Well, now they didn't have to pay us back. Quincy Adams said that $5 million in loans that we gave you, you don't have to pay back. The US taxpayer will pay back our banks. And so they got out of debt that way. Third, let's skip down to the Convention of 1824, and then we'll do the Monroe Doctrine last. So the last treaty was with the Russians. I think I told you in the last lecture that the Russians had outposts as far south as Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. This was a treaty jointly with us and the British signing against the Russians, threatening them to get out. We basically said, evacuate all settlements, retreat back up into Alaska, evacuate Oregon, which was not the state of Oregon, but the territory of British Columbia, Oregon, Idaho, and Washington state, this vast area. Retreat all the way from there, relinquish all claims, and allow America and Britain to jointly occupy it, which we would. Not for very long. This joint occupation would last 30 years. Oregon was so remote, it was practically on the moon. But Oregonians are very proud to kind of rub it in our faces and say, we're older than even you guys. California is, you know, 1848. We are 1818. Portland's an even older city, and that's true. It was kind of a logging town a long, long time ago, and there's a lot of old buildings and structures from the 1820s and 30s there. And it was kind of, Oregon was what Quebec was 200 years before. It was a remote area on the frontier where Native Americans and whites kind of lived in a somewhat peaceful existence, remote, far away from everything. And it was like the last virgin landscape where there was no major cities or factories or smoke in the air. It was just people living very simply. And a lot of people went west to claim their fortunes. When I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, there was a very famous game called Oregon Trail. I think it's fairly popular with you guys. You can get, you know, apps on your phone. And it's about many people who tried their stake at making money in the far west. They would leave their banking job or carpenter job or whatever in the east, and they would head west 3,000 miles and try to make it as a salesman or a fisherman or whatever, or, you know, selling beaver pelts in Oregon with the Nez Perce Native Americans. So this treaty scared the Russians. They withdrew. Now, this is what's known as a condominium, and I don't mean like, you know, like an apartment you live in. What it means is that it's jointly owned, right? That's what a condominium is. If you live in a condominium, the individual owner owns the four walls and the space inside the home, but the building itself is owned by the HOA, and that's what's meant. Likewise, a condominium in terms of countries is when two countries claim sovereignty to one area. It's not going to work in the long term, but for a while, when hardly anyone lived there, just British and American settlers moved into Oregon. Lastly, and this is probably most important, is the Monroe Doctrine. Notice it's not the Adams Doctrine. Even though John Quincy Adams came up with it, he was gracious and said, I'm going to name it after my president, James Monroe. And here's what it says. In 1823, Europe held a convention. It's very interesting. Spain had ever been everybody's nemesis since 1492. Everybody hated Spain. But you fast forwarded 400 years, and people now felt sorry for Spain. It had declined greatly. Every other country in Europe had surged forward. Spain had kind of rested on its laurels and said, you know, we had this past greatness, we had this great empire, and now it was nearly all gone. And what it sent as a signal to Europeans was that Americans were problematic, meaning that we started this revolution, then the Haitians did it, then the French did it, then everyone in Latin America did it. And they felt that people living in America were rightly under the rule of Europeans, and that this was a temporary setback and accident. Now, keep in mind, when we declared independence in 1776, we were the only country in the Western Hemisphere not governed by some European country. By 1823, there were no European countries that controlled anything other than Canada still being a British outpost and a few Caribbean islands, and that was it. So clearly the momentum was on our side, that people in the Western Hemisphere should govern themselves. We believe that, and we promoted revolution. Every European country said this is an accident, and we are going to retake these colonies. France declared it, Britain declared it, Holland declared it, and Spain declared it. And so this was kind of them bellowing across us, across the Atlantic. And so we decided to thump our chest and bellow back. That's what the Monroe Doctrine was. It states that if any European nation seeks to make war and invade any nation in the Western Hemisphere, it would mean war with the United States. So keep in mind what that means. That means if Spain tries to invade Argentina, which is a long ways from the US, that we would come to the defense of Argentina and protect it, and that it would mean war. Now, this was an empty threat. There was no way we were going to intervene in every single conflict in the Western Hemisphere. And the way it was received was with hysterical laughter. The British, the French, the Spanish, they laughed. Oh no, the Americans are angry with us. Whatever shall we do? They saw how we fought in the War of 1812 and they weren't too impressed. Now, what's important though is the Monroe Doctrine will plant the seeds of an eventual policy that becomes as American as apple pie. I mean, the Monroe Doctrine is right up there with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and apple pie and baseball. It's this all-American thing. Now, it's seen as kind of quasi-imperialistic, to which, you know, to some extent it is, but it wasn't meant that way in the beginning. It was supposed to be this positive thing that we're going to protect these new independent countries, and we are going to be the leader of this hemisphere, but not a leader in a dominant way. We're going to try to nurture these new independent countries to success and democracy. So it was meant to be this beautiful kind of thing, but it was not very serious, at least for another 80 years. The first president who really starts to enforce this would be Teddy Roosevelt. And by 1901, the Monroe Doctrine is a reality. Nobody does anything in our hemisphere without our permission anymore, because they know it will mean war with us, because we can now. We are the juggernaut that now can tell everybody what to do, at least in the Western Hemisphere. But sometimes we tell people what to do in the Eastern Hemisphere too. So that was the success record of John Quincy Adams, and it was extraordinary. Now, that's not to say that Monroe's presidency was without any conflict. It was a troubled presidency. He's seen usually as a very good president. Historians rank him very high. His presidency is known as the era of good feelings because temporarily our two-party system went away and there was only one party. Very rare in American politics. Eventually, in the era of Andrew Jackson, by the 1830s, there would be this new party, the Whigs. Basically, it was the old Federalist Party that had resurrected itself out of the ashes and just was saying the same stuff the Federalists had said before. Republican Party would rename itself the Democratic Party. But for a while there, for, you know, a good 12 years, during Monroe's presidency and a little bit afterwards, it was known as the era of good feelings. Everybody got along. Well, there was troubles. Number one, there was the worst financial panic in our history up to that point. In 1819, for two reasons, the economy collapsed. Number one, the resumption of trade after the War of 1812. So for 25 years, Europeans were blowing each other up, fighting. They had surrendered trade of the Atlantic to us, meaning if you wanted to ship molasses from Jamaica back home to Great Britain, it was being carried in a ship made in Boston, in an American-made ship, because they couldn't spare any ships for their merchant fleets during the war. Well, when that ended in 1815, the British and French went back to making ships for merchant fleets. We had to now compete with a new industry, and shipping in New England took a huge hit, and it drove a lot of unemployment. Second, now that it was safe to move west, banks bought up all the land from the federal government in the West, driving the price sky high, just in a feeding frenzy, just buying more and more and more land just to flip it and sell it. This is how the first millionaire in American history was made, John Jacob Astor. He was a banker in New York, and he decided that land was the most valuable commodity, and he was smart and he was right. And he went to a bunch of investors, said, give me your money. I'm going to buy up all the land in Louisiana, all the land that I can get, and in Oregon. And then I'm going to flip it and sell it to these poor farmers, and they'll pay whatever I want, because it will still be cheaper than it is in Europe. In fact, there's a very famous town in Oregon named after John Jacob Astor. It's called Astoria. They made two famous movies there. They made The Goonies there, if you've seen The Goonies. If you've seen Kindergarten Cop, it was a Schwarzenegger movie in the early 90s. It was filmed there. If you want to know the most infamous thing about Astoria, it is the rainiest place in the Western Hemisphere. People in Seattle make fun of people from Astoria, right? Is that I always would make fun of Seattle and say it rains all the time, right? It rains 9 months of the year in Seattle. You know, the state flag is mildew is the joke about Washington. It's just underwater all the time, right? We're in the drought. They get all of our water. Astoria is even worse. It rains 11 and a half months out of the year in Astoria, which if you've seen the movie Goonies, you want to slap Mikey's parents, right? They're poor kids suffering from asthma, and they chose to live in the wettest place in North America where it rains all the time. I don't know about you guys, but if you watch the Goonies and you're happy at the end, I always am upset and cry because it's like, you know, these developers are going to push everybody out of Astoria and they're going to have to move to sunny Southern California. And I say, yay, goody, leave that godforsaken place. But they find One-Eyed Willie's jewels and they're saved. And I'm like, oh, geez, Mikey's got to still live in this pathetic, awful place where they're underwater all the time. When Lewis and Clark got to Astoria in 1804, they both of them fell into a fit of depression because they just, for 6 months, they were like, what's the Pacific Ocean going to look like? And that's just where they happened to land. And they just fell into a depression and said, this is where it is. It's cloudy, it's cold, it's wet, it's miserable, and it never stops. And literally both of them didn't get out of bed for about 3-4 weeks because they just said, I can't believe this whole expedition was for nothing. Well, it turns out there's a lot of good stuff on the West Coast, but they didn't have time to explore all that. Then they headed back. So John Jacob Astor made this fortune buying, flipping stuff, drove the price up, but this is what's known as a speculative bubble. The metaphor is that you can start blowing a bubble, and at first it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, but then what happens? Eventually the bubble's going to pop or burst, as they say. Prices collapsed of land. Farmers then couldn't pay back their mortgages. They were now stuck with mortgages that were worth less than, you know, the money that they had borrowed to pay it off. And it caused a lot of pain in America. Now, because we were a quasi early emerging capitalist country, it wasn't that painful to most people. Most people still were yeoman farmers. The price of grain, the price of cotton, the price of corn dropped, but nobody really starved because it was very easy just to buy land and work hard, and you could still feed your family because you got to keep everything. But it was very painful for city goers, very painful for New England, which was the most urbanized place in America. And recessions are never fun. Second, and probably even worse, there was this calamitous, awful political fight over sectionalism, North and South. Now, the Civil War would be fought in the 1860s, but already by 1819, the warning signs were there. What had happened was Northerners and Southerners started to move west, and they were transplanting their systems onto those Western territories, which made it not only an economic struggle, but a political struggle. And here's what I mean. The first people that moved into Ohio were people from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and Connecticut, and they took those Yankee ideas into Ohio, and people became tanners and coopers and developed a free labor capitalist system there. People moved from Virginia into Kentucky, taking their slaves and planting cotton there. Now, what that means is Kentucky gets 2 new senators, and they're going to try to pass laws that benefit slave owners, right? We want cheap imports so that we can buy, you know, cotton gins and plows and all this farming equipment from Europe where it's cheaper and better quality. New Englanders and people from the North manufactured that stuff and said, we'll be driven out of business. We still need the tariff. Northerners and Southerners had different attitudes about trade. They had different attitudes about slavery itself. They had different attitudes about capitalism, everything. And so what that meant was it was an enormous struggle when an area became a territory to either allow slavery or to ban it. When the Northwest Territories in the 1780s are acquired, Jefferson, a Southerner, actually says, let's ban slavery there. And they do. So slavery would never emerge in the Northwest Territories. They would become free territories and then free states. Slavery was allowed in the Southwest, so those become slave territories and then slave states, with then representatives and senators who represent those interests. And tensions got worse and worse and worse. Now, because of the political structure in America, the North had more seats in the House, just because the North was more populous. Population was higher there, because it's more urbanized, but also immigration. There wasn't a ton of immigration prior to 1820. Most of it was people from Britain and Canada who were looking for cheap land. And they came to the North. There's no opportunities in the South. How do you compete with slaves? How do you go to a plantation and say, hi, I would like to work for $5 a month? Well, I own 200 slaves and they'd work for free. And so immigrants didn't go to the South, which is why the population there just kind of increased naturally through regular birth rates. The North is what really exploded in population. So they dominated the House. In the Senate, it was equal, though. There were 11 free states, 11 slave states, 22 free state senators, 22 slave state senators. So everything was deadlocked there, at least everything over the issue of slavery. Political party system kind of masked this a bit because you could find Northerners who were Democrats and Southerners who would become Federalists or Whigs. But when certain issues over slavery came up, it would get very ugly. So here was the issue. We purchased Louisiana here in 1803. New Orleans itself was so big that Louisiana would become a state in 1812. But no other territories were that big until 1819, when Missouri filed petition to be a state. Their population was high enough. St. Louis was a very old city that was, by that time, about 100 years old. The French had settled it in the 17 teens. And it wanted to become a state. Now, the problem was Americans did not decide the status of slavery there in Missouri. Slavery had existed before we acquired it for 100 years. The French had allowed it there. And when we acquired it, it was thought, well, we can't just ban slavery. There's huge plantations. It would be destroying the economy there. It'd be taking all the property from all the slave owners. We just can't do it. And Northerners thought, well, we acquired all this land and we don't even get a say in whether slavery spreads into those territories. That's not fair. We need to decide this issue. Now, the key difference is when a territory is a territory, you can tell it what to do. It has no rights. Territories are governed by the federal government. We can tell Puerto Rico and Guam and the Virgin Islands what to do because they're territories. The Congress governs them completely. Can't tell a state what to do. States are semi-sovereign. They get representation, and you got to kind of back off of certain issues. Missouri was petitioning to come in. So this is the last chance. So Northerners kind of bound together, and they, in the House, rallied behind this law known as the Talmadge Amendment. James Talmadge, a Democrat from Pennsylvania, said essentially, Missouri will enter the Union, but it will have to phase out slavery. Slowly, over time, it'll take 40 years or more, but we're going to force them to adopt in their state constitution a clause that says any person born after 1819 will be born free, and that way all the people currently as slaves will eventually die out and slavery will die out with them. This passed the House easily. It got to the Senate and it deadlocked 22 to 22. And both sides dug in their heels and they refused. Men like John Calhoun from South Carolina promised that if the Talmadge Amendment passed and Missouri came into the Union and had to, basically would come into the Union as a slave state, but be forced to become a free state within 40 years. He said, South Carolina will secede, we'll form our own republic if this happens. Northerners said, you're bluffing, we don't believe you. And we were very, very near civil war. People were massing armies. South Carolina was, they were ready to secede, they were ready to defend themselves. Northerners didn't blink, they said, no, we don't believe you. This became this huge titanic struggle in the Congress. In walks one of the greatest Americans ever that never became president. He's sort of my vote for like the greatest American politician that almost nobody knows, Henry Clay. Henry Clay saved the Union 3 times from civil war, and he's not on any of the money, and he should be. He was always my vote for who should be on the 20 instead of Andrew Jackson. It's very bizarre. Andrew Jackson hated paper money and the National Bank, and he's on a Federal Reserve $20 bill note. 2 things that he hated, paper money and the National Bank. Clay liked both of them. Clay's from Kentucky. He's a very interesting character. He is, Kentucky was known as what's called a border state. Today you might call it a hybrid state, where Northerners considered it a Southern state and Southerners considered it a Northern state. Yes, it was a slave state, but only about 18% of its population was enslaved. In the southern part of the state, there's a lot of cotton plantations. But in the northern part, if you go to Louisville, a lot of people think, oh, Kentucky's so conservative. Look at it. Mitch McConnell's their senator. Rand Paul's the other one. That's the rural areas of the state, particularly in the eastern part that's bordered with Ohio and Appalachia. Louisville's a very I've been there. I spent more of time in Louisville than any other place other than cities that I lived in. I went there for 9 days in 2013. Felt like I lived there. I was there for so long. It's a cool town. It's very cool. And I talked to a lot of people there. And what was very funny is I had a roommate from Mississippi who claimed that Kentucky was not a Southern state. And then you got a lot of people like me who said it's a Southern state. People talk funny here. Y'all eat barbecue. You know what grits are? You're a Southern state. this is the legacy of sort of the geography, much like Maryland was, much like Delaware was, much like Missouri was. It's sort of a hybrid state where in the big cities, there's banks and, you know, big shipping lines and factories. But in the southern part of the state, there's plantations. So Clay was a man of both worlds. He was not a plantation owner. He was a lawyer. So he owned a handful of house servants. He was indeed a slave owner, so he could understand their point of view. But he also believed in a lot of these Yankee ideas as well, like a national bank, internal improvements to tariff, so he could see their point of view. And he was kind of the one man in the Senate that said, I'm from both regions. I'm not loyal to either one. Why don't you do my plan? Because I'm not loyal to either side. Let's just do what's best for America. So he went to the Northerners and he said, you got to drop the town, Jim. I know this guy, John Calhoun, he's insane. And anything he says he's going to do, I believe it. He's going to break up the country. We can't have this. Northerners said, we can't do that. And he said, wait just a minute. We'll add Missouri as a slave state, and then we'll add a free state to balance it out. That way nobody gets an advantage. And Northerners said, where are you going to add? There's no population in the Western territories of any free area that's big enough. He said, you got to think outside the box. The Constitution says we can take pre-existing states and cut them in half and create new states. And there was this weird relationship that Massachusetts had with Maine. It was almost like a colony of another state. It was non-contiguous geographic areas that were all part of the same state. It was the District of Maine and the state of Massachusetts, had been since the 1620s. And they wanted independence. They resented, you know, the government of Boston. They didn't like it. And Clay went to his friends, Daniel Webster and John Quincy Adams, and he said, you got to talk to your people and you got to agree. Cut Maine off from the rest of Massachusetts. You'll get your 2 senators and representatives. There'll be a new northern state to balance out Missouri. What do you say? They reluctantly agreed. Many people never forgave Daniel Webster for doing it because they said he was a sellout. There was, in fact, a book written called The Devil and Daniel Webster. And in the book, Daniel Webster sells his soul to the devil being the slave power. And he did agree to this, but Webster was a Union person. He said, if I can take the loss, but America is preserved, we'll extinguish slavery in the long run. And it was probably a good thing he did this. This is the Missouri Compromise. Essentially, this issue of over Missouri is solved. It enters the Union, and it's not going to be told to do away with its slaves. It will do away with its slaves during the Civil War on its own. Talk about that later, but not in the 1820s. Now, the big problem was this was going to come up again and again and again. If you just let people move to the territories and stake claim there, then it will come in as free or slave without any national plan or strategy. So let's make a plan right now. Clay got out the map and he said, why don't we bisect the territory here at this latitude line, 36 degrees. I couldn't do a degree sign there. I don't know how to do it on PowerPoint, but it's supposed to be 36 degrees, excuse me, 30 minutes north latitude, this line right here. So in the end, it looks like the North is going to win. This whole green area here in the Louisiana Territory, along with Oregon, everyone knew slavery was banned there. Those would eventually come in as free states, and it would be a lot. People speculated 12 to 24 states would be carved out of that region. South of that line, all you were going to get was Arkansas and Oklahoma. So most Northerners said, all right, we'll take the L here on Missouri, but we get Maine, and the rest of the territories eventually means that in the next 40 years, we're going to win, and we'll just dominate in the House and the Senate. Then we'll eventually amend the Constitution to do away with slavery by 1860. What's interesting is Southerners signed on to this plan. Men who were slave owners in 1820 all agreed it was an institution that they wanted to keep for a while, but they were willing anyway to talk about extinguishing it. What would upset this whole plan is the Mexican War, because the US would conquer the entire Southwest, and then the situation rears its ugly head again, and we have to argue over slavery again. So, very disturbing trend. We very nearly had a civil war. Clay's political genius forced us to step back from the brink. We set aside the slavery issue for another couple of decades, but it was troubling. Many people alive at the time said this is a bad sign for the future. This issue is going to come up over and over and over again, and it would. So that's it. I'm going to make questions and go ahead and answer that. The lecture is done. We can move in to the Jacksonian period next time. Fun stuff, Andrew Jackson. If nothing, he's not boring. So we'll talk about him next time. All right, guys, have a good weekend. See you.